continuing and scaling up the humanitarian response and making sure that it reaches all those who need it. Taking those facts in account, there is no doubt that the idea that men, women, and children affected by armed conflict and entitled to be assisted and protected is in today unchallenged. The main emerging issue should therefore be that people affected by conflict have rights and cannot be treated as mere object of charity. This range of concerns automatically involves the crucial issue of accountability, defined in moral, operational, legal, and political sense. In addition to criminal accountability, there are forms of accountability that are also important for victims and the subject of international legal obligations. My personal observation is that there is a big focus on criminal accountability, judiciary accountability. Although the field situation requires also to take in consideration need for non-judiciary accountability. There is high need to strengthen victims' witness approach. It is important for true justice and reparation to ensure equal approach and synergy of all forms of accountabilities. At the same time, it raises question of subject entity that is able to deal with this serious and complex issue, which includes protection, assistance, establishment of central data of different victims categories, such as missing persons, victims of sexual violence, children. This issue can't be led by executive government. Definitely it opens a new challenge, maybe for National Human Rights Institution for Human Rights. Please allow me to conclude. The accountability requires a strategic approach with equal treatment, judiciary and non-judiciary accountability based on broader consultations of all stakeholders and in accordance with international human rights standards and humanitarian law. A particular attention should be given to needs of vulnerable groups, primarily women, children, persons with disability, and elderly. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jasmika, for those comprehensive yet sobering welcome remarks as we kick off the turn now to kick off the panel. Today, we are honored to welcome Mr. Yuri Belosov, the head of the Directorate for Counteracting the Crimes Committed in the Context of the Armed Conflict in the Prosecutor General's Office. Yuri is essentially the head war crimes prosecutor in Ukraine. We also have Ms. Kate Gibson, who is counsel at the International Criminal Court and a senior legal advisor at the Public International Law and Policy Group. Previously, she worked as a legal consultant to the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission in Myanmar. Also, a welcome to Ambassador Anton Koryanovich. He's the ambassador at large for war crimes in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. Ambassador Koryanovich is also the agent of Ukraine before the International Court of Justice and the allegations of genocide case against Russia. We have Professor Milena Stereo, the managing director of the Public International Law and Policy Group, who holds an endowed chair at Cleveland State University's Cleveland Marshall College of Law. And then we will have closing remarks by Ambassador Filipenko. I will offer the floor to each of our panelists to give their remarks. We will then move to the Q&A portion of the event. Let me start with Yuri. Yuri, please outline the accountability mechanisms available for prosecuting perpetrators of atrocity crimes in Ukraine and Ukrainian priorities for accountability.
Thanks, dear guests, Your Excellencies. First of all, on behalf of the Prosecutor General, let me apologize for him that he is not present at this event due to some extremely important and unexpected events. My name is Yuri Belosov. As I was presented, I'm a head of brief name War Crime Department. And before I would start the opening remark, let me express our gratitude for the Public International Law and Policy Group, the Permanent Mission of Ukraine in Geneva, and all members of the group of Friends of Accountability following the aggression against Ukraine for organizing this event. I will just give you some figures because you're all pretty well aware what's happening in Ukraine right now. But by this morning, so we have more than 35,000 war crimes being launched, which are related to the aggression since February, because all we know that the war started 8 years ago, but we counted this figure just for this year. These war crimes led to the deaths of more than 7.5 thousand civilians. That's just the figure that we already know. So, but we all understand that the real figures are much, much higher because we don't have access to some occupied territories. And including that figure, almost 800 children were killed. We have more than 45,000 civilian objects being totally destroyed during these 6 months of war. Ensuring the proper investigation of serious violations of international humanitarian law, that's definitely a priority of the Office of the Prosecutor General. That's why we have a specialized department in the central office, and we are working on establishing teams of war crimes prosecutors at the regional level. Plus, we work with the police and security service investigators who already have also the specialization of war crime investigation. Thanks to active cooperation with the international institutions and foreign partners, the capacity of the national system to effectively investigate war crimes and bring guilty persons to justice has been significantly strengthened. So we have on the ground a huge number of very profound international experts. Plus, we do our work in a close cooperation with the national NGOs who also document war crimes. Also, as you know, so the Office of the Prosecutor of International Criminal Court initiated investigation on the situation of Ukraine based on the state referral of 39 members of the Rome Statute. And we really believe that shortly the ICC would have its own office in Kiev, which also would have the chance to make our cooperation even more effective. And recently the Parliament adopted some changes to the Criminal Procedure Code, which gives more power to the ICC to operate on the territory of Ukraine. Also, as you know, so we'd like to stress the importance of visiting Ukraine by the representatives of International Independent Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine and the reports which given as the results. Commission has visited 27 towns and settlements and has interviewed more than 150 victims and witnesses. Its investigators inspected sites of destruction, graves, places of detention and torture, as well as weapon remnants, and consulted a large number of documents and reports. As you already have seen in mass media recently, all these dramatic events and the discoveries which were found in the Kharkiv region, in Izium, and some other cities. On each of these cases at the national level, we start the investigation according to our criminal code, and we had a special article on war crimes, which gives us the power to, according to the best international standards, to document and investigate these events. What we should say that the findings, let's call it like this, in Kharkiv region, so we're almost the same as we found in the previous region, which were deoccupied after the Russian invasion. In particular, the already world famous name Bucha and other cities of Kiev regions, where we have these atrocities, graves, torture, rape cases. We found absolutely the same in Kharkiv region and in other regions which were deoccupied. And it just shows us that these are patterns of Russian behavior, Russian army treatment of civilian population. It's not just cases committed by individual soldiers. It really gives us the understanding that it's a systematic approach, which is Russian leaders are well known about this. We also should mention that reacting on these findings, we are trying to build the specialization of our work. Within the Department of War Crimes, we have specialization working on torture and mass killing cases, on attacks on civilian objects, on mass deportation, crime of aggression. And recently, by the decision of the Prosecutor General, there was established a special unit in our department, which is focusing on sexual crimes related to the sexual violence crimes related to the conflict. It's a specialized unit which would deal with most serious cases and which also would supervise the investigation of such cases on the ground. And we already have 3 cases related to sexual violence sent to the court. But we understand that it's just the top of the iceberg, and we already got the information about much bigger number of such cases. And we plan to, and I believe within the months, to adopt the strategy on combating such kind of crimes related to sexual violence. And we really believe that main focus should be done on support of victims. And we really appreciate the support of our national and international partners who help us to do this work more effective. We also should mention that the UN Commission, which visited Ukraine, also documented cases in which children have been raped, tortured, and unlawfully confined. We all know about the mass deportation of our population to Russian territory, including children. So they actually steal our children, which we consider as a stealing of our attempts to steal our future. And we definitely would prioritize these type of crimes, and we really hope that the international community would support us as much as possible. I would also like to, in the end of my welcoming remark, to note on the urgency of creating a special tribunal for the crime of aggression, and Mr. Anton Karinevich, who would have a floor after me, so he would definitely stress more on this. But we also understand that the crime of aggression is the mother of all crimes. Just because of the aggression, it became possible. And if we would leave this without the punishment for that, so it really gives a chance to other countries to follow the same behavior as Russia does against Ukraine and previously against other countries. And let me just in the end to express my gratitude to all of you for the support of Ukraine, for your help which you provide in absolutely different forms and manners. We really, and Ukrainian people really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yuri, for those very insightful and distressing comments and facts about what's happening. What are the consequences of the atrocity crimes that are being committed in Ukraine by Russia? Let's turn to Kate. And Kate, if you could build on Yuri's comments and share with us what lessons learned we have from other efforts to prosecute atrocity crimes and hold senior leadership responsible for those crimes. Kate?
Thank you very much, Paul, and good afternoon to your excellencies. Thank you on behalf of myself to the Permanent Mission of Ukraine here in Geneva, to all the co-sponsors to this event, many coming from the group of Friends of Accountability, and of course to all panelists and all the participants joining us today. As a legal community, we've been debating the issues arising out of the questions of accountability for Ukraine for sort of weeks and months now. And so to be able to have those discussions today at such a high level, and together with these really important voices and perspectives from Ukraine, really is a privilege. I'm coming at this from a practitioner's perspective. I've done 2 cases before the ICC and have represented accused before these tribunals for Rwanda, Sierra Leone, the former Yugoslavia, Cambodia. As Paul asked, what can we learn? What lessons can we take from the prosecutions that were done in those conflicts and in those contexts, and what could we have done better? Many of the problems we saw arising from trials in those other courts came from the fact that the trials were distant, not just in terms of being physically removed from the crime sites and the witnesses and the country, with witnesses having to travel sort of across the world to participate and testify, but also being distant in terms of being removed from the community and the culture and the legal culture and being conducted in different languages through interpretation. So from the start with Ukraine, things are different because we do have functioning judicial and prosecutional authorities with specialized officers for the prosecution of war crimes that we've just heard from Yuri. In other post-conflict societies, this just wasn't available. In Rwanda, there wasn't an option for the domestic courts to prosecute crimes immediately after the conflict. So I think the first question is, how can we, as the international community, support these domestic frameworks to build and prosecute these cases in Ukraine itself? So that's the first aspect. The second aspect is that, as we've also heard today from Yuri, we have these calls, both from inside Ukraine and outside Ukraine, for more than just domestic prosecutions. And we now have this sort of list of concrete proposals for what criminal accountability could or should look like in Ukraine. And we've got, you know, even greater insight today as to how Ukraine itself views these options and these preferences, which, you know, really has to be at the center of this question. Whatever framework is adopted, or whatever combination of frameworks is adopted, what we can draw from past experiences is that a priority has to be making sure that the trials themselves are viewed as being legitimate. Meaning what? Meaning that the population that's affected, so the people in whose names, you know, we're seeking this justice, are part of this process. And not just that they're being informed about it, but that they can help shape and create what the accountability frameworks look like, and then that they have access to this justice, you know, so that can actually come and be close to these proceedings in every sense, which makes it even more likely that the trials will be viewed as legitimate and as of assistance to the population in question. Another common problem that we saw across the different international courts and tribunals was access to evidence and the quality of evidence. And these cases really do stand or fall, which they sometimes do, on the basis of evidence. And in Ukraine, again, already access to evidence is an issue. The conflict's ongoing. You know, there are areas, Crimea and the East, that are inaccessible, but we do have this advantage being the Commission of Inquiry, which released its oral update last Friday here in Geneva. You know, what we would have given in the Rwandan context or the Kosovan context to have had an independent international Commission of Inquiry on the ground during these first vital stages, you know, to be able to build a contemporaneous record of events, to start to contextualize the crime base, and even just being there to sort of update the Ukrainian community and the international community on what's going on. And so I think another question for us today is how we can, as states or as individuals or as CSOs, how can we support the work of the Commission of Inquiry? Because their work is what's going to inform the accountability that comes next, whether national or international. Because we know that commissions of inquiry and fact-finding missions don't act alone. The Ukrainian Commission has issued a public call for submissions that's on the OHCHR's website. And we can see here that the Commission is welcoming engagement with state authorities. So with prosecutors' offices who we know are already investigating and collecting information about crimes and who might be in a position to share that. And also with CSOs and NGOs who are documenting in line with best practices, or who are even just engaging with the victim communities and are in a position to share what they're learning. In my experience at the Myanmar fact-finding mission, states who want to support and contribute the Commission should start thinking outside the box in terms of, you know, just typical prosecution type materials. They can also submit analysis of human rights violations, the source material for those analyses, any satellite imagery they might have, really any sort of direct and first-hand material that can complement what the Commission itself is collecting. Which brings me briefly to Paul's last question. What do we do with all this information that's being collected in these early stages? Is the goal really just to see defendants in the dock, or just to get a favourable outcome at the ICJ? Or are there non-judicial mechanisms that we're not thinking or talking enough about at this stage? Because as we just heard earlier in the welcoming remarks from the Commission of Inquiry expert Yasmin Kazuma, the focus so far has been on individual criminal responsibility, you know, for members of the military and civilian hierarchy to be held responsible for aggression and held responsible for war crimes. But we know that there are these other modalities for non-judicial mechanisms that have been put in place in other situations of mass criminality. So just briefly, putting criminal trials to one side, putting aside the ICJ and the European Court proceedings, we're talking about here truth-seeking measures or truth and reconciliation type structures or programs for reparations, specialized units for missing persons, specialized units for displaced persons, restitution and compensation commissions. Because we know that criminal trials, ICJ proceedings, these are long, these are selective, these are difficult, these are expensive processes, and they have uncertain outcomes by their nature. And in the past, we've seen that there are these non-judicial measures that can operate not necessarily as alternatives to criminal trials, but as complementary measures where we can start this process of putting victims back to where they were before the injustice occurred, before the harm occurred. I think it's clear that we have a lot to continue to think about and engage on, but I think today is a really important step in this discussion. So I'm really grateful to the organizers, and I look forward to continuing to engage with you and our Ukrainian colleagues on these really important questions. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Kate, for that intervention and for sharing your thoughts of the over a decade or so work that you've been doing on international criminal justice and how we can ensure that the prosecution of atrocity crimes meets global standards and Ukrainian standards of due process. Let's now turn to Anton. And Anton, if you could share your thoughts with us about the priorities for Ukraine and the various mechanisms that Ukraine might be prioritizing in the effort, both international and domestic, to hold responsible those who've committed atrocity crimes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul. Good afternoon, dear colleagues, excellencies, distinguished panelists. It's a big pleasure and honor to participate here today with you in this side event. And of course, many thanks to Commission of Inquiry for their job of work. And we really hope to see more of the information in relation to, in particular, the occupied territories of Kharkiv region and other places which now may be accessible for our partners. It's actually rather easy to try to answer to Paul's question due to the fact that our president, His Excellency Volodymyr Zelensky, was talking about them during the general debate on the opening of the 77th session of the General Assembly. And I think that he put rather straightforward that accountability is one of the priorities and one of the vision and instruments of how Ukraine sees the end of this armed conflict, the end of this war, the end of this aggression. And accountability takes this senior place in this thing, in this structure. And when we talk about accountability, of course, we talk both about a responsibility of state, of the Russian Federation as a state, as a sovereign player. And we, of course, also talk about individual criminal responsibility for the mass atrocity crimes, but not only them, committed during the armed conflict. I think that now, since 2014, and my colleague Yuri was talking about that actually this aggression started in the end of February 2014. And since that time, Ukraine vastly uses all the possible mechanisms and instruments which international law can give us in order to bring accountability for the violations of international law in and against Ukraine. We even, as you know, have a term for that process, lawfare. Whenever the Russian Federation wages warfare on the battlefield, using these tactics, horror tactics about which colleagues were saying here, in particular against the civilian population, Ukraine is doing its job in the courts, providing and doing lawfare against the Russian Federation. And you will find no court or tribunal which we could use, but could but didn't use. So we used all the possible courts and tribunals to go and to bring Russia and Russian citizens to responsibility. We have 2 cases in the International Court of Justice, several interstate applications in the European Court of Human Rights. We did use the instruments of ITLOS, International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. We do use the instrument of 2, we have now 2 tribunals, arbitration tribunals under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. We do cooperate effectively with the International Criminal Court, and in particular, really, we made several amendments to the Criminal Procedural Code in order to ease the work of the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC here in Ukraine. And of course, we are looking forward to opening the field office here. And also, we, as you're all well aware, we recognize the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court without the final date. So saying this, we use all that we can, but we see that these mechanisms are not enough. We see that the conduct, the behavior, the pattern of behavior of the Russian Federation is still here, that they do not want to stop committing these mass atrocity crimes, that the aggression is moving on. And that is why the president himself and the government of Ukraine suggests that we need to fill the gaps which currently exist in international justice system, in particular in relation to Ukraine, in particular in relation to forming the comprehensive accountability system. 2 of these mechanisms or 2 of these instruments are, the first is a compensation mechanism for the damages caused by the Russian aggression, which should be about compensations to the victims of this war and of mass atrocity crimes. And the second instrument or mechanism is actually the Special Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine. And I think that it is very important here, together with these panelists and with this audience, to say and to talk that actually, looking at these 8 years, we may not leave this war of aggression against Ukraine without relevant legal answer and relevant legal response. There really might be doubts whether the existing international courts and tribunals can go directly for the political and military leadership of the Russian Federation. Understanding that one needs to establish the chain of custody and all the other issues in relation to, in particular, the war crime committed in Bucha and the person who sits in the Kremlin. So we cannot have a situation when somebody, especially those who are on top of the tree, are not brought to responsibility for that atrocities and for that situation. So that is why we do consider that a relevant legal response to that situation would be an establishment of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. National courts cannot work with the at least troika of the Russian Federation due to immunities ex officio. International Criminal Court also, as of now, doesn't have and will not have in the future jurisdiction over the crime of aggression against Ukraine. So we do see this gap, and we do consider that if we bring perpetrators of the crime of aggression against Ukraine, first of all, we will make justice prevail. And second, we will not let this situation happen again in the contemporary international relations, contemporary international law, saying that dictatorships will see that international law matters and that you cannot deliberately attack another state whenever there is willing to do so. But our idea of the special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine is the idea of an ad hoc tribunal. So we do not want to invent a bicycle or a universal mechanism which would work for everybody. We pretty much understand the leading role of the ICC, and as I mentioned, we cooperate effectively with the ICC, but we want this special tribunal to supplement the work of the ICC in relation to crime, which ICC objectively cannot adjudicate now, the crime of aggression. And we do believe that establishing of such a mechanism would be beneficial for international law in general and would really enable this justice brought to our citizens. Because, of course, it is important to have the direct perpetrators or their military commanders in courts and tribunals, but it is important to have the principal ones, the ones which gave orders, the ones who made this whole war possible. So saying this, Ukraine now works closely with our international partners, exploring, considering, deliberating, discussing the possible models on the establishment of the special tribunal. We will for sure continue doing that. And this is a task from the president. This is a task from our leadership, and we will do this. We already got support, political support from parliamentary assemblies of international organizations. Namely, we have 2 resolutions of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, 2 resolutions of the European Parliament, declaration of the Parliamentary Assembly of NATO, resolution of the Parliamentary Assembly of OSCE, resolution of the Parliament of Lithuania in support of the establishment of the tribunal. We do have states which univocally say that they will support this endeavor, and you may have heard this lately, several days ago in New York, during the events, during the high-level segment week of the UN General Assembly. We also do our internal work in order to both show the priority to both our international partners and our Ukrainian stakeholders, and to make this work more effective. In particular, several days ago, the interfractional unit in the Ukrainian Parliament, Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, was established. That interfractional unit is called Tribunal for Russian Aggressors. It now enlists more than 50 members of our parliament, and they will work together with parliaments of foreign states in order to get support to the idea of the special tribunal. Several days ago also, the president has adopted a decree establishing the official governmental working group on the work of the project to establish the special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. We use pretty much every possible platform, every possible possibility to talk about which way, how to structure, how to build this tribunal, which way to choose, to talk with our international partners and colleagues, because of course, we duly understand that all that processes should be built on the basis of the principles of rule of law. This tribunal should be legitimate, this tribunal should be credible, this tribunal should work on the basis of the best applicable international standards which apply today by different international courts and tribunals. One of the key questions, of course, here, when we talk about the idea of establishing the special tribunal, is the question of immunities. This is the obvious elephant in the room, and we will, of course, try to elaborate and to choose such a model which would be, as I mentioned, as legitimate and credible to see the results of the tribunal. Because we here in Kiev and in other places in Ukraine, we are sure that the place of the people who started the war against Ukraine, their place is together with the criminals of the Second World War. And in order to achieve this, they should be labeled as international criminals, not only politically, but also by international courts and tribunals. And we do believe that one of the mechanisms which can enable this is actually the special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. To finalize, two thoughts, 2 ideas. The first one goes about that actually international law. It wasn't easy for international law to create the modern understanding of the crime of aggression. And it would be a big tragedy for international law if the crime of aggression remains a paper tiger, included in some treaties, in some documents, but not being able to be brought to life. It will be really a big, I think, failure, and we will not let this happen together with international partners. And the other issue is that having indictments and arrest warrants for the people who committed and still commit aggression against our nation is really a big step forward to getting justice. So in the end, I will just once again say big thank you to being here today with you, to the organizers, to the PALPG, of course, to our permanent mission in Geneva, to Her Excellency Ambassador. And we are always here to work on the issue of accountability as one of the priorities for our government. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Anton. That was a very crisp and clear articulation of Ukraine's plans for accountability for the atrocities being committed by Russia. Let's now turn to Milena. Milena, there were a number of themes that Yuri, Kate, Anton developed in their comments. And given that you've worked on atrocity crime prosecution, transitional justice throughout the globe over the last 20 years, I'm hoping that maybe you can pull together some of these themes, have some comments, and in particular address the question of deterrence and the necessity for doing it right and doing it well in Ukraine in order to deter future aggression around the globe.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, Paul. And let me begin by thanking the Public International Law and Policy Group, as well as the Ukrainian mission and all the sponsoring states for making this event possible. It's truly a pleasure and an honor to be here with all of you. So in terms of themes that most of our panelists have discussed today, I would start with the theme of accountability, but accountability in a way which encompasses non-judicial measures in addition to criminal prosecutions, such as the protection of witnesses and victims, such as the establishment of units for missing persons, reparations, restitution, memorialization, truth-seeking, guarantees of non-repetition. These could be equally important as traditional accountability. And as my colleague Kate Gibson mentioned, sometimes traditional accountability measures can be expensive, can be selective. And so it's important to complement traditional accountability with these broader non-judicial measures. Second, the theme of cooperation. And I'm particularly thrilled to be joined here by Yasminka representing the Commission of Inquiry. Her remarks have clearly highlighted the need for cooperation for Ukrainian national level prosecutions to be successful, as our Ukrainian prosecutor Yuri mentioned as well. They need to be supported by the international community. They need to be complemented by international experts, international supports, and it's going to be particularly important going forward that we have appropriate synergy and complementarity between national level prosecutions and then also other hybrid and also international level prosecutions. Third, I would highlight the importance of legitimacy. If we think of lessons learned from other conflicts, as my colleague Kate Gibson also highlighted, it is important for any investigations and prosecutions to be legitimate so that they appropriately correspond to the needs of the relevant people, of the affected people. Trials and prosecutions and investigations have to be perceived as legitimate, have to be adapted to the need of the particular context. And so going forward in the context of Ukraine, it is important that whatever national or hybrid or international level proceedings do take place, that they maintain legitimacy. Next, and I really want to highlight this point, as Anton just talked about, the importance on focusing on creating a way to prosecute the crime of aggression. As Yuri mentioned, this might be the mother of all crimes, and prosecuting the crime of aggression truly enables us to impose accountability on those most responsible for this conflict, on those who decided to invade Ukraine, on those who decided to actually initiate this conflict. And so however this might be done, whether it's through the creation of an ad hoc tribunal for aggression, and I know there have been several proposals as to how to go about it, it is important to create an accountability mechanism that will actually be able to prosecute the crime of aggression. As Anton very appropriately mentioned just a few minutes ago, it would be a tragedy for international law if the crime of aggression remained theoretical, if in this particular context, when it's so clear that the crime of aggression has been committed, we did not find a way to actually prosecute those responsible. I would also add that creating a mechanism for the prosecution of the crime of aggression is particularly important because of deterrence. deterring future leaders or current leaders from the commission of atrocities elsewhere. Current or future leaders, if the crime of aggression is prosecuted now, will forever be on notice that this type of behavior will not go unpunished. And last but certainly not least, let me highlight the importance of lawfare, which Ukraine has been truly incredible at. And this might be something that in other contexts, in other conflicts, we might be actually learning from the Ukrainian situation. I wish I did not have to say that. I wish this were, the last conflict on earth. I wish no other place were ever in this situation. But unfortunately, to the extent that these types of conflicts takes place again, I think there's a lot to be learned from Ukraine, from the way that Ukraine has used international law, international legal mechanisms, tribunals to its advantage to establish that violations against Ukraine have been committed. The way that Ukraine has used the ICJ, the International Court of Human Rights, the Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, as well as the way that Ukraine has worked with the International Criminal Court is truly remarkable. And I think there's a lot to be said about future conflicts and how lawfare is actually one of the most important ways, if you will, in fighting aggression. So Paul, let me pause here because I know we have a number of countries that also wish to intervene, and I hope that we have time for some questions as well. But it has been a pleasure to participate today, and I look forward to hearing from states and from other colleagues.
Great. Thank you, Milena. And I would just echo your observation that it has been an impressive effort by Ukraine and Friends of Ukraine to engage appropriately in lawfare and to utilize, as law professors, you and I are always telling our students, international law matters. It's nice to actually see that it can be utilized to some degree to push back on aggression, atrocity crimes, the erosion of territorial integrity. So thank you for highlighting that. What I want to now do is turn to some of the representatives from the delegations that make up the group of Friends of Accountability, and then to Ambassador Filipenko for some comments, and then if we have any time remaining, to open it up to questions from the audience. If anyone who's attending has questions now, go ahead and put them into the Q&A function of the Zoom, and feel free to direct it to a particular panelist. I want to turn first to representatives from the Danish mission, and then the Dutch mission, and then the Lithuanian mission. So if we have a representative, I'll turn to you, Sinja, to activate the mic for any representative from the Danish mission. We have someone who's just come on screen from the Danish mission. If you could come off of mute and then go ahead and share your remarks. We'll give this just a couple more seconds. So Ambassador Berg, I can see that you're on the screen, but you're on mute. Okay, so let's do it this way. Ambassador Filipenko, if you'd like to make a few sort of concluding observations, and then if representatives from the Dutch and the Lithuanian could also join into the Zoom screen, and then we can turn to them once you've shared your thoughts or observations. Ambassador Filipenko.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. I would like to thank the PILPG, the co-sponsors of this event, the distinguished panelists who contributed to our discussion, for making this event a substantive and a meaningful one. The discussion that we had today, and we heard from our panelists, give us hope that international law does matter, and the accountability is an important instrument into ensuring protection of human rights, prevention of further human rights violation, compensation of victims. You have heard from the Ukrainian panelists that Ukraine is seeking justice, and the people of Ukraine deserve this justice in the face of unspeakable injustice inflicted upon them by the Putin's regime. The fact that we meet in the margins of the Human Rights Council also shows that, highlights the role of Geneva and the Human Rights Council and its instruments, in particular, Commission of Inquiry, in international comprehensive efforts to achieve accountability and justice as an important prerequisite of a lasting peace on our continent. So I really hope that the comments and the inputs that we will hear from the delegations will confirm these points. I thank the panelists again and the organizers of this event.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador Filipenko. We have an intervention from the delegation from Lithuania. So if you want to come off mute and go ahead and make your intervention, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Williams. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you just fine. It is perfect.
Okay. Allow me to thank sincerely the Permanent Mission of Ukraine in Geneva and members of the Group of Friends of Accountability for organizing this important event and for tirelessly raising the issue of accountability. Lithuania stresses the importance of strong response to Russia's and its accomplice Belarus' brutal, unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine, gross violations of international law and human rights. We commend the efforts of the Commission of Inquiry, all partner countries, international institutions and organizations, including the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, the European Court of Human Rights, Eurojust team, and encourage to consolidate and advance joint efforts. In this regard, we support establishment of the special tribunal to address the crime of aggression against Ukraine. A joint investigation team was set up by Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine in March 2022. Being the first team of its kind, it was also the first to be joined by the prosecutor of the ICC. Here, more members, Estonia, Latvia, and Slovakia, joined as well. We are convinced that such cooperation improves preparation of documents and mapping of the crime committed and identifying those responsible. Furthermore, we have to ensure that principle aggressor pays the damages is fully implemented in this situation. Lithuania strongly supports efforts to establish a legally sound mechanism for confiscating frozen Russian state assets, as well as those of the sanctioned Russian citizens and entities in order to ensure them for restoration and the benefit of Ukraine and its people. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you for that intervention. We now have an intervention from the Permanent Mission of Poland. Go ahead and come off mute and share your thoughts.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
Now that I would like to thank co-organizers and panelists for this very timely and important event. Accountability for violations of international law committed in the Ukraine by Russian Federation should remain a priority for international community. And Poland has always called for bringing perpetrators of the said atrocities into justice. We continuously support the work of finding investigative and accountability mechanisms mandated by relevant international organizations. And In this scope, we welcome the work of the dedicated Human Rights Council's Commission of Inquiry, and we also were part of the broad group of OSCE participating states who twice invoke OSCE Moscow mechanism to examine the violations of the international law and human rights law caused by Russian aggression. Having said that, I have a question to the panelists. How to ensure complementarity of different accountability mechanisms and how to avoid duplication of work and efforts within them. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Would one of our panelists like to, maybe Anton or Yuri, pick up that question?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I think I may start. Maybe, of course, colleagues will join. So this is, of course, a very important question from Polish delegation. Many thanks for that, because once again, we would like to stress that we are not willing to make some alternative mechanisms, to create some mechanisms which would create alternative practice. We really want this comprehensive accountability system to be established, and meaning that this comprehensive system should have these complementary elements to each other. And they do see and feel that there will not be great problems with that, because on the work which we do on the governmental level, so we understand that the ICC works effectively and hard to get the responsibility for the crime of genocide, alleged crimes against humanity and war crimes, and they will work with Ukrainian prosecutor's office. I'm sure Yuri will add how to make this all the most effective thing. For the special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine issue, duplication is not a problem at all, because the crime of aggression under international law is a leadership crime. It means that not so many persons who were in a position to start the aggressive war and to hold the aggressive war can be tried by such a special tribunal. So I'm sure that actually this is not about duplication. This is about really complementing and supplementing and establishing the mechanisms which are now lacking, and the relevant lacunes and gaps exist. I thank you.
If I may just to add a couple of words, in addition to what Anton said, I just wanted to say that from my perspective, just one way how to avoid duplication is to have effective communication. Because otherwise, so we could have duplications even in Ukraine if you don't talk to other guys who could investigate absolutely the same case as we are in Ukraine. But we have the situation when we have universal mechanism, we have Ukrainian national system, and we have several countries who started their own investigations and who actually could also try to bring to justice the same person as we trying to bring justice in Ukraine. That's why Ukraine now is trying to establish effective coordination with the Eurojust, with the Europol, for example, to avoid the duplication with other countries, with the universal jurisdictions they try to use against the crime committed in the territory of Ukraine. As to the ICC, we have also the communication. We meet every day. Just today we had 2 meetings already, and that's we are trying to, just to say one general rule, we agree that if someone would be prosecuted in ICC, we are not prosecuting him here. If we prosecute someone here, ICC doesn't prosecute it in their country. That's just the general rule to avoid this double punishment. But how to identify again? So if you don't talk to each other, duplication could be. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuri. And Milena, I know you want to intervene on this.
Sure, I'll be very brief just to amplify some of these points. I really don't see duplication as a big issue here, because the different mechanisms, the ICC or the Special Tribunal for Aggression or Ukrainian national courts, will essentially be able to prosecute different individuals and different crimes. So for example, as we know, the ICC can really only prosecute a handful of individuals, does not have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression. The Special Tribunal for Aggression would focus on prosecuting Putin and the leaders for the crime of aggression. And then the Ukrainian national courts can complement all of this by prosecuting lower level offenders, for example, for war crimes and crimes against humanity. So I think it's really more important to think about how these different mechanisms can cooperate, as they have been already, in terms of sharing of the evidence, access to witnesses and victims, as opposed to worrying about the duplication. I really don't see duplication as a problem. I actually see it as a very positive thing here, because we have a variety of potential mechanisms available, which would allow for broader prosecutions for different crimes and going after different individuals, different perpetrators. Thank you.
Thank you, Milena. Yasmika, would you like to jump in on this?
Yeah, exactly. Now we have heard how those criminal accountability is coordinated, and it is more, I'm looking from that vertical level of coordination between international criminal accountability mechanisms and national criminal accountability mechanisms. But that what is a challenge for all subjects involved in this, that horizontal coordination between different actors when we are speaking on criminal accountability and non-judicial accountability. First of all, who is that responsible to coordinate activities related to support and protection of victims and witnesses? Who is responsible to coordinate those different categories? To do registration database of missing persons, victims of sexual violence, and so on. It should help criminal accountability, because when you have a central database of victims, when you have all those parameters, it is easier for them to get information, to collect testimonies of those victims, and to eliminate possible duplication of testimonies, and what creates additional traumatization towards victims. I'm looking on that the guidelines for all types of accountabilities, including criminal and non-criminal accountability, should be made, because all of us are temporarily on some positions, and the people can be changed on positions, but at the same time, procedures should be should stay and should lead all officials. And definitely, I'm in favor to create some guidelines for between among different entities involved, that all aware how does proceed in different circumstances, and also to think on that who is that body who can coordinate victims' issues. As I stated in my presentation, maybe it is challenge for new window for National Human Rights Institution on human rights. Definitely, because it is not executive branch, it is independent body, and somebody must do those things. But definitely, I'm always in favor of ownership of government in which conflict is going.
Great. Thank you, Yasmika. Let me now turn to a couple of questions from the journalists in the audience. First, we have Emma, and so I'll put her questions out there, and then we'll turn to Jamie from the Associated Press. So Emma has two questions, the first of which is for you, Anton, which is, could you elaborate further on your plans for the Special Tribunal for Aggression, where will it be set up, who will be partnered with, and what is the time frame? And then the second question is for Yuri. Will you indict President Russian Putin, and do you expect the ICC to? Why has this not been done yet? So Emma is not shy about asking questions. Anton, and then Yuri.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Concerning timeline, it's of course a very sensitive issue, because if it was only for Ukraine to do that, we would do that immediately, and the result would have already been established. But of course, understanding that this should be an international mechanism, we need to explore and consider and discuss with our partners all the possibilities, and to choose the most feasible and effective variant. But we are effectively on the way, and we will do all that we can in order for the special tribunal to be established. It is obvious that such a tribunal can be established on the basis of several models. First, this may be an international tribunal based on a treaty between states. Second, it can be a tribunal based on the agreement of Ukraine and the United Nations, having before that the passing of the relevant resolution of UN General Assembly. Third variant, it can be something of a European nature, meaning the agreement of Ukraine and European Regional Organization. So we are exploring, elaborating all the issues. The question is sensitive, but what I'm sure about is that we can cope with and deal with all the legal technicalities, all the legal issues, all the legal challenges, whenever we have the understanding that we need to do that. And by saying we, I mean not only the government of Ukraine, but of course, our international partners in particular also.
Thank you, Anton. Second question is for you, Yuri.
I would love to have Putin in our jail. So just what I could tell you. So we would love to do whatever we could do. Unfortunately, international law, prohibits us to do this. That's why we really need international system which would be able to prosecute the leader of Russian Federation. And I really believe that International Criminal Court would have all strengths and powers to do this. From our side, what we could guarantee that we would help ICC to collect all evidences which could make it possible.
Thank you, Yuri. And the second question comes to you and also possibly Ambassador Filipenko. And that is from, I have to find it here now. One second. That is from Jamie with the Associated Press. What are the prospects that an international criminal tribunal might be set up to look into war crimes and other rights violations? How likely do you see this happening? And what has your office turned up regarding deportations of Ukrainians, including children, to Russia, and what can be done to hold those responsible? And this tracks some of your earlier comments, Yuri. So if you want to expand on them, this would be a great opportunity.
Okay, let me start from second part. We have a separate investigation on deportation and filtration camps. And for us, we have a separate investigation on genocide. And definitely these cases are very related to each other. We also understand that filtration camps and deportation is part of a bigger process, and genocide maybe is just a fundamental things for that. That's why definitely we are investigating, we are gathering this information, and that is what is also within the focus of the ICC, deportation of children in particular, and sure of adult people. It's difficult for Ukraine absolutely now to prosecute us. We are gathering information as much as we could. So we don't have access to the occupied territories. We don't have access to Russia. Definitely that limits our power, but anyway, we have an opportunity to fix properly, because no one knows exactly when the number of people being deported. It varies from 20,000 till 200 or 300,000 of people. It's a huge number. That's why, again, at this stage, we are trying to fix it as much as possible and to get this information from our partners and to involve our partners to investigate this. As to the tribunal, I just very briefly said that definitely I believe that war crimes will be the focus of the tribunal, because for that we have the ICC, which is working on that. Definitely, we also understand that, and Anton maybe could correct me, that for the aggression, the consequences is not obligatory. So the aggression itself is already a crime. But sure, all war crimes which have been committed after the aggression, all crimes against humanity and all atrocities which should happen, definitely could show the consequences of aggression. And in this respect, it could be somehow reflected in the position of prosecutors in tribunal. But the investigation itself definitely would be done by the ICC and Ukrainian law enforcement system. We just maybe in there, sorry for taking this time, need to mention that sometimes it's different perspectives how and who should prosecute perpetrators. We are strongly believe that 99% of perpetrators should be prosecuted in Ukraine, and that's our task. And what we are doing, we just seek the international help to do this. We don't wait that someone would come and do our job for us. We also don't think that Tribunal for Aggression, ICC, whatever, would take thousands of perpetrators to account. No, it's not their task. This task is to use a complementary function. That's why it's so important to strengthen the national system. That's why we really want to get the best expertise from all over the world, to train our investigators, to train our prosecutors, to establish environment where they could do their job, during the war in the best possible manner. Thank you again.
Thank you, Yuri. Anyone else want to weigh in on that question? If not, I will turn to a question from Jennifer Trahan and then invite any other members of the delegations who would like to make an intervention. Please note it in the Q&A, and then we can add you to the Zoom call. But did anyone else want to intervene on that question? Okay, Anton, I see you reaching. You're either muting me, Anton.
Just maybe because we had a question on duplication, a very important one. And I think that it is obvious why we do not suggest to establish some kind of a big international criminal tribunal for war crimes or crimes against humanity in Ukraine, because we already have national courts and the ICC. And having both national and international jurisdiction on crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes, it is really no use in establishing something additional. So this is why we suggest the establishment of the special tribunal for only one crime, but which is not covered by anything. So we are very rational. We are very feasible in that respect, I would say.
Thank you, Anton. That was very helpful. Let's now turn to the question from Jennifer Trahan, which involves the one of perception. In some circles, it appears that Europe and NATO countries are highly focused on this war. And how can Ukraine and other countries persuade these other regions around the globe that it's in their interest, because aggression is something that matters to all countries? And this touches on, Milena, what you mentioned earlier about deterrence, and Anton as well, what you mentioned about deterrence. Anyone want to pick up that question? Ambassador Filipenko.
From day one of the Russian unprovoked and unjustified invasion of Ukraine, we have said in international organizations that it was an attack not only on Ukraine, it was an attack on international order. And the fact the UN General Assembly adopted the resolution aggression against Ukraine with 141 votes in favor demonstrated that this aggression concerns all countries in the world. So I think this resolution is the one of the first evidences to arguments for those countries that this is a violation that concerns us all. We also said that Russia's violation of UN Charter is a violation of their security, because for many countries, the UN Charter is the only guarantee of their national security. So any violation, if remains unaddressed, will leave them insecure. So nobody could feel safe if we do not address the Russian violation of UN Charter. So these are the arguments that we use with other countries, and we see an increased understanding, and we see continued support of countries who want to defend international law, international system, who want to defend multilateralism from violations and abuses. So that would be my response to that.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador. Let me now turn to one last question from Alexandra Koch. And she's concerned about immunities under international law, and is wondering if the panelists can highlight further why it is so critical to be able to prosecute the crime of aggression, which Ambassador Filipenko, you had just done, and how does one address the question of head of state or other immunity in these prosecutions? Milena, maybe I should turn to you first and then to Anton.
Sure. So the issue of immunities is an important one in international law, and we have really alluded to this without going into much detail so far. But essentially, there's a principle of international law on immunities, which says that sitting heads of state are immune from prosecutions at the national level, immune from prosecutions by other states. However, we do have precedent from the International Court of Justice back from 2004, the so-called Eurodia case, where the International Court of Justice specifically said that this principle does not apply in the context of international criminal prosecutions. And so if we're talking about prosecuting Putin or another sitting head of state or another sitting Russian leader, for example, in this context, that type of a prosecution would have to occur in some supranational tribunal. It could not occur at the national level in the Ukrainian national tribunals, which is what Yuri alluded to earlier when he said how international law prohibits specific types of prosecutions in the Ukrainian courts, and Anton talked about it as well. So that's an important issue. We would need to create some kind of an international tribunal to prosecute sitting heads of state. And then the other thing that I would mention here, which has to do with prosecuting the crime of aggression, is when we're talking about prosecuting the crime of aggression, we are really talking about prosecuting sitting heads of state. We're talking about prosecuting Putin and other Russian leaders. As I mentioned, because of immunities, they cannot be prosecuted at the national level. And as Anton mentioned earlier, the International Criminal Court does not have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression here because the crime of aggression has a much more limited jurisdictional regime in the ICC. And so the only way to get around this is to create an international ad hoc tribunal that would have specific jurisdiction over the crime of aggression, which would thereby evade this problem of immunity, because it would not be a national tribunal, it would be an international or hybrid tribunal, and it would be, the statute would be written in a way where this tribunal would have specific jurisdiction over the crime of aggression.
Thank you, Milena. Anton, did you want to jump in, or anyone else? Kate, maybe? I saw you reaching for the button, Anton.
Yeah, just I mean, Milena did a great job in explaining this issue. That is why it is very important for us to establish international tribunal, which can work on the basis of international jurisdiction, saying that crime of aggression is an international crime, and that the sitting head of state cannot have an immunity for that crime before a legitimate and credible international tribunal. So this is it. If we could, I'm sure that we would have already tried that persons domestically, but since the immunity issues, we need to invent this mechanism to do that.
Kate, did you want to share some of your thoughts on this?
I think Anton and Milena have it covered, but can I just have 2 minutes to talk about this issue of documentation and over-documentation that so many people who are involved in this space are talking about, and somehow we didn't get there today. But you know, we talked a lot today about cooperation, and we know that there are all these different groups, NGOs, CSOs on the ground who are very determined to try and support the efforts towards accountability. And the way that they're doing that is trying to collect information on the ground, speak to witnesses, speak to people who've been involved in the conflict, and somehow capture or record their stories. And so in the last few months, we've seen this sort of narrative emerging about concerns being raised about over-documentation. And Myanmar is often cited as an example, with people using it as a sort of cautionary tale. There was too much documentation in Myanmar, too many people went down and collected too much evidence, and it ended up watering down the strength of the evidence that was being collected and made it more difficult for prosecutors to then build their cases. I think in the same way that our concerns about duplication might be in some way exaggerated, I think our concerns about over-documentation might fall into the same category. I certainly haven't heard from anyone who's saying that there's too much evidence being collected and we should all slow down. I think what's very important is that the collection of evidence and documentation that's happening is done in accordance with best practices, always in accordance with the principles of doing no harm and not subjecting vulnerable victims to situations that are making things more difficult for them. But I'd circle back around to Yuri's earlier comments, which are the importance of communication and coordination between the groups involved in these various efforts, because we have this wonderful situation where there is so much goodwill, and we want to make sure as all the different groups who are on the ground that we're channeling those efforts in a way that's going to be most useful for our Ukrainian colleagues along the lines of the priorities and the preferences that they've adopted, that they've set out here today, which was so useful for us to hear, you know, in black and white. This is what we want as a community, and this is how we see accountability panning out. So I just wanted to throw that topic in because I think it's one that we're all discussing a lot. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Kate. I see you've prompted Yuri to jump on in to this conversation point as well.
We'll try to be short. Just very briefly say that situation of Ukrainian context is a bit different from the ones which was before, where there was absolutely disabled state which didn't want to or couldn't investigate war crimes. That's why international mechanism was like a substitution, absolutely independent with NGOs, with international courts, which did the job on the ground. That's why when it happened in Ukraine, there is still some perceptions with some NGOs, international community, that they would do, and using best practices, they would gather evidences for court. But we should say that if we say about best standards and best practices, but if we talk about that 90%, as I said, 99% of all cases would be prosecuted in Ukraine, it means that standards should be in compliance with Ukrainian criminal procedure code. If it's not, we just can't use any word, any photo, any video in any proceeding. And we have the situation where a lot of information being gathered, being given to us. And when they say, okay, thank you guys, now we think what to do with this, because for ICC maybe it works, for national courts it doesn't work. But victims were interviewed for several hours, a lot of documents being gathered, and we understood that we have to re-interview, but within the criminal investigation. That's why what we are trying to establish, you know, cooperation, because I'm a former head of NGO, that I could say like this, that we have to establish proper coordination with NGOs, saying, guys, for Ukrainian courts, please don't do the job instead of us. Give us contacts of victims, witnesses. We would come and do this. Give us video and tell us where you get it, because we need to explain to the judge where we find this video, not just found in my office somewhere, or because it doesn't work. But at the same time, these high standards, international standards, are relevant for ICC, for UN committees, which is also extremely important to get this information. But this, sometimes we have this misunderstanding about different standards and which should be taken into account. But that's why I really believe that the cooperation with NGOs, which now Prosecutor General is really pushing, because we had several meetings, we have some specialization meetings with different NGOs, it would help not to have over evidences, but to use it, not to keep evidences. Then that the worst, when you have evidence or information and you don't use it properly to prosecute, that's the worst situation. And I really believe that we would manage to get rid of such risks. Thank you. Talking too much today, I think.
No, that's great. That's the, I think Kate was trying to spark a little bit of conversation there. So that was great.
See how I kicked the beast and you took the bait, Yuri. So thank you.
We have one last intervention, and that's from Sven Benthaus from ETAF. Sven, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm forensic expert, and thank you, Kate and Yurif, for this very important discussion, because we are also involved in the documentation, and we are running a training for documentation from the forensic part. And already in August, we made especially to this item conference in Geneva, where we would like to have a common agreement about the way how to get a commitment between the Ukrainian procedure code and international standards. And I think that's the most important step to go in line, not only with the Ukrainian law, but also with international standards. And now we have an approach to do this, because international standards may not be augmented when there is no legal base. And so we are running this first course next week in Hungary, and hopefully we will get good support. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sven. I really appreciate that intervention. Let's go ahead now and close this side event. I wanted to express my gratitude for all of the various missions who've dialed in to hear this event, for the group of Friends of Accountability for co-sponsoring the event hosted by the Ukraine mission and by PILPG. And in particular, to Yasminka for opening up the conversation and making the introductory remarks. And all of our guests on the YouTube live streaming and our Facebook live streaming. I say that as if I actually know what that means, but my team has told me we're live streaming and have hundreds of folks watching on those platforms as well. So thank you to all of our panelists for your thoughts and our co-sponsors on how to design mechanisms for and promote accountability for the atrocity crimes that are occurring against Ukraine. And with that, we will close this side event for the 51st session of the Human Rights Council.